take them out as a tool and apply them to conflict in any situation in your life. So, what you're going to learn from this workshop, first off, how and why you should change the way that you think about conflict. Perception has a lot to do with this. Your intentions have a lot to do with this, and I want to talk about that because conflict is widely seen as a negative thing, and after studying it a little bit, I don't think that it needs to be. And then I'm going to teach you my 4 steps that I created for working through conflict, and the acronym is conveniently PAID. So when you're at work and you want to work through a conflict, just remember you want to get paid. So get through the conflict. And then finally, we're going to do a little exercise before and after teaching you guys the steps for implementing these steps to see what they would look like in a more real-world example. Okay, so I want to start off by warming you guys up a little bit. I want to ask you all individually how you feel about conflict. Like I said, people tend to anticipate negative outcomes, have a negative connotation with conflict. So in a few words, share out what comes to mind when you think of conflict. And some of you filled out the survey too, so maybe just recall what you wrote down. Give it to me.
I said challenging.
Okay.
Challenge. Anxiety.
Okay.
I said small, because conflict can often make me feel like I feel small.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Augie?
Sometimes it's like confused.
Okay. Ryan?
No.
Okay, you gotta think about it. That's fine. Okay. So when you're faced with conflict, what tends to be the first thing you do? And answer this instinctively. You enter a situation, you're like, okay, this is gonna be messy, this is gonna be a conflict. What's your first move?
Is this, okay, not my initial feeling, it's like what my plan of action, my first
step.
My first instinct when I hear that is to suppress my feelings and listen.
Okay.
I'd say, yeah, listen.
Okay.
I'd say ideally listen, but not always.
Ideally, yeah. What do you tend to do? What's your first?
It depends.
Okay.
Who you're in conflict with.
It's very situational.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, next question I want to ask you guys, what does resolution look like to you? When you think of a resolved conflict, what are the aspects of that resolution? What do the people on the other end look like? How do they walk away from the conflict feeling? What makes a conflict resolved?
Trying to put yourself into the other person's shoes.
Okay. So maybe feeling
Maybe
like you've
like-
done that successfully.
Like understanding where they're coming from.
Okay.
And then also understanding where you are coming from.
Yeah.
And respecting that.
For sure. Anybody else?
Yeah, I would say just like mutually understanding like each other's point of view.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, cool. And then lastly, how often do the conflicts that you guys face tend to get resolved in the workplace?
I would say most of the time.
Okay.
So like pretty rarely that they don't get resolved.
Okay. Okay. So we're going to go into our little exercise here. So this is a sample conflict scenario, and I'm going to run through it with you guys, give you a second to think about it, and then same thing, we'll kind of share out thoughts and opinions about how you would handle this. So, you run a marketing team, and your boss tells you that you have not been coming up with enough ideas. You have a week to come up with a new idea for a new product. You have a great idea, you want to create a social media campaign with all new graphics and digital art to catch the attention of consumers. You ask the lead graphic designer to start working on new designs. The lead says no, that they can reuse the graphics in campaign formats that they already have, and designing a new one is unnecessary. You find yourself going back and forth with the graphic designer about what would make a better campaign for the new product. So, I know this is a big question, I'll give you guys a second to think about it, but how would you handle this conflict? Or what would resolution of this conflict look like to you, if that's maybe easier to answer? And you can talk amongst yourself.
I know what I would say. I mean, I would just say, like, with marketing and campaigns, it's like statistics, so it's like I would evaluate, like, whatever the impressions or impact was of our campaign already. Like, obviously, if my boss wants something new, like, we need, or like, also it's like looking at the demographic, like maybe the last campaign was reaching like a different demographic. Like, basically, simple answer is like finding the value of having the new campaign. Like, you have to prove the value to the designer to want to spend the time on doing the work.
Okay.
And at the end of the day, if they don't want to, then you have to have a conversation with your supervisor to talk to them about it. 'Cause
Okay.
that's over your head.
So your role can be implementing logic, kind of evidence to back what you're thinking and what your plan is and why this needs to happen, and then if not, go to a superior. Does anyone else have ideas that kind of align with that or have some differences?
I think it depends on the type of person you're working with. If
Let's
you're working with
see.
somebody who's like really, really stubborn and is not gonna work with you, maybe it's best to just like work behind their back, make something new, and then show them how awesome it is.
So I will say for this situation, an important point of it is that you need this graphic designer to want to work with you. So essentially they're like this gatekeeper to your idea reaching its full form, right? Like, you can't go graphic design an entire new campaign. You need their help. So you need to work together on it. That's another aspect to keep in mind.
I mean, I think that like explaining that the boss wants something new is like,
Okay.
I feel like we're assuming that they don't know that the boss specifically asks for something new.
Yeah.
So like that's kind of a point that's not touched on
Okay.
I guess beforehand.
I will say though, like, even sometimes when you say like, oh, like this is what we're being asked to do, like departments butt heads, and so it's kind
This
of
is
like,
a different department, right?
yeah.
So,
So you have, I don't know. I think it's just about proving the value and showing the impact. Like,
Okay.
a lot of people feel like they're being asked to do things because they feel like it's busy work for them. They have a million other things on their plate, blah blah blah. So you have to like show them, like, not just ask a question. You have to like explain like the details behind your question and the impact.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I like where you're going with that. Does anyone else want to add anything before we move on?
Or if like the reasoning behind why the graphic designer is saying no, like, is it because there's too much on their plate, or is it because they genuinely feel like they have older designs that would work? Like, what's kind of the reason behind why they're saying no, I guess?
Okay. So figuring that out
Yeah,
is
and
your
then-
initial step.
Yeah, and then explaining like your perspective more clearly.
Okay. Cool. Okay. So we're gonna leave that behind. We'll come back to it towards the end of the presentation. Right now I want to move on to why you guys should change the way that you think about conflict. So a lot of people have a negative association with conflict. You think, okay, I'm faced with a conflict, it's an oh no type of situation. If you go into something feeling like that with a lot of uncertainty and having doubts in your ability to handle it, chances are it's not going to work out as well as it could if you went into it with a more positive mindset. So having confidence in your ability to handle conflict will affect your perception when you're faced with conflict. So if you're ready prepared, you're more likely to take something head on, work through it more swiftly. Ideally, everyone involved is also going to be more prepared. Secondly, I've learned from this class to view conflict as an opportunity, which at first sounded a bit far-fetched to me, and then when I learned more about it and learned what resolution can look like, especially in a corporate setting where you're working with different teams, like Sarah was saying, and you have to combine creativity with logic and appealing to different audiences, conflict can really present an opportunity for growth and improvement from all ends if it's handled well. And lastly, if you can handle conflict in a respectful and effective way and you don't view it as this big negative thing, you are likely going to have better experiences with the people that you work with and people that you may get into conflicts with in the future. Conflicts are inevitable. If you have trust in yourself to work through it well, then you're going to go into it with more confidence working through conflicts with people builds a better relationship than what you went into it with, if that makes sense. So keep this in mind as to why any of this is important. Okay, so another huge thing, conflict is inevitable. 85% of employees experience conflict in the workplace. I would assume it's more than that, because I think that conflict is a part of any teamwork situation, and there's very few jobs where you're only working with yourself and you're not doing any customer work, you're not working with coworkers. If you're working with other people, you're going to see conflict. Yeah, an average of almost 500,000 employees resign each year due to conflict. And I mean, just with these statistics, you can imagine how much this is costing companies too. So conflict is very much an issue. Incivility is a big part of conflict, which I perceive as people handling it poorly or maybe making it more personal than it needs to be, not knowing how to navigate conflict with respect for their peers. So that's another thing that I wanted to look at in this presentation. We're gonna watch a TED Talk, but only a couple minutes of it.
Rule number 1. Move toward the conflict. Most of us don't like conflict, but it's normal, healthy, and totally human. Without conflict, problems hide everywhere. Big problems we all want to solve. So, conflict is information. And handled well, conflict is opportunity. So rather than running from it or pretending it's not there, move toward it. More on this in a minute. But rule number 2, you don't know anything. And even if you do, pretend you don't. Ask questions about people's experiences and listen to what they say. Important things will be said because you're there listening, and the better you listen, the better the people having the conversation will listen to each other. And finally, rule 3, keep quiet. Don't panic in the few seconds it takes for people to respond. They just need time. If you're jumpy about pauses, they'll see that and lose confidence in the conversation. Some of the best breakthroughs I've seen in really difficult conversations have emerged out of a brief period of silence. Don't rush in to rescue everyone from that awkward moment. It's your job to show them that moment is okay.
Okay, does anyone have questions about that? I've come across this TED Talk a couple times, and he goes into more examples and how those little steps that he has can relate to a variety of situations, but I think that that's well said. So I wanted to include that.
Rule number 1.
Okay, so we've talked about what resolution looks like. I want to talk about collaboration. I've learned more about it in this class than I thought I would. I thought I understood what collaboration was, but knowing more about it has also really changed my view on conflict. So the definition of collaboration that I've been working with is using integrative behaviors and developing mutually satisfying agreements to solve the problem once and for all. And I really like that last part about once and for all, because I think we've all experienced conflict that doesn't get resolved, and it often shows up with the same person or with a similar scenario down the line. So really resolving something once and for all is a huge point of this. What is required for collaboration? A commitment to a mutual end goal. So if you're working with someone from a different department, like our example scenario, working towards a mutual end goal can look like recognizing that you are both working behind the same product. You both want sales to go up. You have a mutual goal. So committing to that goal and having that be the inarguable end that your product is successful, having that be the end of your conflict is really helpful because it's something to work towards constantly. A lack of defensiveness is huge. I think that defensiveness is the number one thing that's going to send a conflict downhill. Collaboration is about teamwork, and winning is reaching that shared end goal with mutual effort. So not viewing conflict as a win-lose situation. Letting go of the sense of competitiveness and defensiveness. That goes along with letting go of ownership over ideas. This has to do with depersonalizing, and say you have an idea, if you align yourself with that idea so closely and subjectively, you're going to get defensive over it when people want to make changes to it, when people want to expand on it, when people want to alter it. So if you can let go of ownership over that idea, you're actually subjecting it to grow and have all these other people's input put into it, and it could become something way better than what you would have come up with on your own, potentially. So then more on integrative behaviors, cooperation, flexibility, and teamwork. I think that goes without saying. The difference between collaboration and compromise is a really big point. Collaboration meets everybody's needs, and compromise, everybody gives up some of their needs. Collaboration is mutually satisfying, and compromise is more settling. And collaboration, because of those two outcomes, is more effortful. There's more to work through. It's not abandoning the project. It's not abandoning the commitment to reach that end goal. Compromise can be much less time consuming, but oftentimes compromises are made too early, and they're very surface level, and more likely than not, they only provide short-term solutions. So collaboration is kind of the long-term solution. So that's something to keep in mind. Okay. 4 steps for resolving conflict. The acronym is PAID. And that stands for prepare, actively listen, identify, discuss, and display. Okay. Step 1, prepare. Plan a place and time to discuss. You can also think of this as plan and prepare. I just wanted to keep it more concise. Allowing time for de-escalation is really important. That ties into depersonalizing the issue, but giving it some time and then planning, as this conflict is something that's happening at work, a time and a place to discuss, setting aside time for a quick meeting or something, having designated time for this conflict to be worked through. And then another part of preparation is knowing exactly what you want to say. So what are your needs going into this? Know the specifics of what points you want to make. So, for example, you want this graphic designer to know that your boss told you to do this. This isn't just a preference thing. That's a really big point that you want to make. So that's a specific to keep in mind. And overall, the goal in preparation is to know what you want to say well enough that you don't have to think about it when you're hearing out the other person. So you've internalized your goals and your needs and what you want to get out of this conflict, and you know it so well that you're not sitting there thinking to yourself, reminding yourself what all of the things that you want to say are. You can actually sit back and listen to the person. And lastly, depersonalize the issue in this step. Again, letting go of ownership of ideas. Take a moment to recognize this is a work-related issue. It's not a life-related issue. I think that takes some stress off of conflict. And it does not need to be personal to you or your counterpart. Step 2, actively listen. This is one of my favorites. If I had to summarize active listening, it is listening with the intention to learn something. So it's not sitting there waiting for your turn to interject. It's not sitting there waiting until you hear something that you can respond to or that you can share your story with. It's sitting back and trying to figure out what their needs are, what their goals are. Maybe you have some common goals. And then taking from that TED Talk, assuming that there's something that you can learn from this discussion, having that intention really allows you to actively listen. And also that ties in with not being defensive, listening, thinking about how you two can collaborate, ask questions, ask them to elaborate. And paraphrasing, I've seen as a really good tool for making sure that somebody feels understood and heard, and also so that you are hearing them correctly. So every once in a while, saying something like, so I'm hearing you say this is what your needs are, this is what you want, this is what you're struggling with, is that correct? And ask that honestly. A big part of active listening is empathy. So go into it with the intention to understand. I is for identify. What are the other person's motives? So they'll tell you what they want, what outcome they want, but this step is really to figure out why they want it. My analogy for this, in simplest terms, as far as identifying motives, if you can imagine a child getting in a fight with their parent. The kid wants to stay out later, the parent wants them to come home earlier. So those are the two wants, right? I want to stay out earlier, I want to come home earlier. If the kid can stop and look for a motive, they might be able to recognize that the motive is that their parent wants them to be safe. They want to know where their kid is. They don't want them to be in danger. And motives are much easier, most of the time, to work with than wants. So if you can recognize somebody's motive, like from the position of the child, you can say, okay, I'll share my location with you, and I'll call you every hour. How about that? That satisfies their motive. So you can apply that to any interpersonal conflict, I think. So that is really what encapsulates this step. Going along with that, identifying the source of conflict. So why is this a conflict? Does somebody feel like they're being asked to do more than their job requires? Do they not have enough time? Was it communicated poorly? That also kind of goes along with looking for what their motive is. And identifying your areas of common ground and common goals. I had already touched on that in the last step, so we'll go to the next one. The last one is discuss and display. So, what have you learned from them? Are their motives something that you can work with? Again, kind of reframing how you were looking at the conflict originally. Talking about your common ground and your common goals. Acknowledge if you recognize now that you had a part in the conflict, people will really level out with you if you are willing to have some humility. And talk about how your understanding of the conflict has changed after hearing their perspective in full. And then ultimately, the discussion ends when you can arrive at agreeable terms with both needs met. And then this part I think is really important, creating a plan that puts it into action. So what are your next steps together? I think that leaves the conflict on a really good note. And lastly, the display of your understanding, the display of your empathy, the display of all the steps that you took before this. Practice them as the plan unravels, and then plan to revisit the issue and make sure that things are still working. Again, we're talking about being in an office, being in a corporate setting, touching base in a couple weeks from now and saying, hey, did the strategy that we came up with work out well? Are you struggling with this? Do we need to tweak anything? I think that goes a really long way with coworkers, I would imagine. So those are the 4 steps, and we're going to go back to our sample conflict. And I want you to each kind of think about how these 4 steps would apply to this conflict. So I'll go back to all 4 of them. And I'm going to give you a minute. What are you all thinking? Does anybody have any questions right now? I'm realizing this is kind of information heavy.
Just process it.
Yeah. Do you guys want to share out what you're thinking as you're thinking it?
What is the question?
How would you apply these 4 steps to the sample conflict about your graphic designer not wanting to work with you? You actually already talked about one in your initial response. So you had said, make the point that your boss is asking you to do it, and you identified a common goal of wanting to be successful.
I would say showing the value, but I did miss like understanding why they said no.
So in this scenario, that could have looked like what you were saying about like they feel like it's just they're doing busy work or something, and it's not something with real substance, doesn't really matter. Or maybe they're pressed for time, and that's also something that you can work with. Anyone else?
I think paraphrasing is like, if not like the most important part of it. It shows that you were listening to them, and then it also just aligns. Like, if you don't paraphrase, you could leave the meeting and have a totally different idea of what they said versus what they meant.
Yeah, totally.
And then you're just spending time on worthless, and then they're gonna be pissed that you spent all this time on not what they wanted.
Yeah, exactly. And then it's a waste of your time too, right?
Yeah.
So that's like
And causes more frustration.
Yeah, you both want to get paid.
Mm-hmm.
So you want to be doing your job correctly, and that has to do with managing your time well and making use of your time. So if you set aside time for a conflict, you better be actually listening to them and trying to work through it. Does anybody have questions on active listening? That's a really big topic that I really quickly brushed over. Or does anybody know anything about active listening that they want to contribute?
I think it's the hardest thing to do, because when you prepare, you're just trying to remember all your points. But sometimes it's hard to have your brain just like focus on what they're saying.
Yeah, totally. It is really hard.
And it's not that like you're trying not to listen to them, but maybe you just need to prepare more so you're not having to cycle the points in your brain.
That's why I thought about that step. Yeah, because I feel like active listening is, like you're saying, the hardest part. And I think that it's the center of all these other things happening. Because it's rooted in empathy. It's rooted in wanting to genuinely understand where someone else is coming from and to learn something from them. But yeah, active listening is definitely an intentional practice. Like, it is not a mindless activity. You're sitting there and trying really hard to absorb what someone else is saying. And that circles back to intention, right? Does anybody have any questions? No? Sarah, that was your favorite part. Does anyone else have something that stuck with them specifically about other things?
I'm thinking about active listening still.
Yeah.
Because, yeah, in my profession, that's something I deal a lot with and talk a lot about with my peers. And we live in a society that is constantly distracted by other things that are happening around us. People have devices on them ringing constantly. People have screens that are all around the room. People have chatting happening various places. You could be solving conflict in a public space.
Yeah.
And it's hard to give all of your attention to one thing because our lives are not one thing at one time.
Yeah.
There are lots of things happening all at one time. And being an active listener really does take a lot of energy and practice.
Yeah.
And understanding how to be a good active listener is really important.
Would you say that the step to prepare, like setting aside a time and a place so that you can be more focused? Because this isn't a work setting.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that directly correlates to the active listening step.
Yeah, definitely.
You didn't like dive into this, but you mentioned how conflict is like that most people view it negatively, but you didn't really dive into like why we should view it positively. So I think that would be good to talk about. And I also think like conflict is a positive thing. Honestly, it's a relationship building thing. Like, you feel so much closer to someone after going through a conflict that was resolved well. So it's like your time to prove that you're like a reputable, genuine, like person that wants to work towards an end goal. Like, so I think it's a relationship building thing. And especially like in a customer setting, like it sucks if something explodes on you, but it's all about how you handle it and get stuff back to like normal again,
Yeah.
and then they just have way more trust in you and
Yeah.
way more faith in you, and so I think
Yeah.
it's positive in that way.
And just building relationships in general. I mean, it is a lot of the time, the first time that you're working with people is the first time is conflict. It's conflicting. So this is kind of your impression, I think, too. And I want young people going into the workforce to think about that. It is a big reflection on you. Everything you said is why I think conflict can be positive. Additionally, just for the sake of ideas and creativity, conflict is an opportunity for an idea to grow. So if you let go of ownership over it, if you let other people work on it, collaborate, you're flexible, you're willing to go through whatever means necessary to be as successful as possible, conflict is how you get there. You need to talk with more people than just people that agree with you, right? So, anyone else? Okay, I'm going to conclude now. What I want you to take away from this workshop. So, the aspect of conflict that tends to feel the most intimidating is the aspect of uncertainty. So we have an innate dislike for uncertainty. And essentially that's just feeling a lack of control. So you're faced with a conflict. The anxiety behind it is usually rooted in worrying about losing control. So being prepared is going to help you feel more in control. Conflict is inevitable, but the way that you choose to handle conflict and the way that you choose to react and show up in it is within your control. So focus on what's in your control, and you're going to feel better going into it. And then, lastly, mindset and intention are really big. I think that dealing with conflict well starts with the choice to deal with it well. And everything else that follows is also a choice. Active listening is a choice. Choosing to prepare ahead of time is a choice. There's a lot of intention involved in it, and it's important to maintain that level of intention throughout the entirety of the conflict and following. So, revisiting your plan, making sure the resolution worked, you need the intention of getting through it well and with others to start and end that. We're done. Thanks. Do you have any questions?
That was a really good